シリーズポストコロナ世界における分断と交流、外国人研究者が見たコロナ禍の日本。こんにちは、ナビゲーターのサヘルローズです。このシリーズではコロナ禍の日本に残り研究を続けていらっしゃる外国人研究者の皆様をゲストにお迎えいたしまして、異国の地で迎えたこの大きな変化をどのように受け止めていらっしゃるのか、そしてこの変化は日本社会にとってこれからどのような意味を持っていくのか、それぞれの専門分野のご意見を伺っていきたいと思います。お話を伺う研究者の皆様は、国際交流基金が世界中から毎年お呼びしている日本研究フェローの方々です。さあ、今回のスピーカーはこの方です。文化人類学者として歌舞伎町に着目し、その多様な成り立ちとその変遷について研究していらっしゃいますナサニエル・スミスさんです。
My name is Nathaniel Smith and I'm an anthropologist.
So Nate, what was it like to go through the pandemic in Tokyo, both personally or professionally?
It was really difficult, and I don't think that's something unique to me as somebody doing research, but being so far from home and away from family, of course, compounded feelings of isolation that I think a lot of people felt with social distancing, with being away from workplaces, and living in not quite spacious apartments. So one of the things that I did over the earlier months of this year was to try to go on long walks around the city. I'd do that at least several times a week. I'm living in Waseda, so I have lots of access to interesting locations, but it was nice to get some exercise, sometimes in the middle of the night, some social distance. There's nobody around, not wearing a mask, so that was one thing that kind of helped to mitigate the feelings of loneliness or feeling cooped up that came from the pandemic. Professionally, it's weird because, as an anthropologist, you're sort of conditioned to want to interact with people. And so it can be really hard to figure out how to recalibrate your research to a time when being with people is really something you can't do. But on the other hand, anthropology is really open to mixed methods. So, continuing to read, following people on Twitter, thinking about the news, doing archival research. There are lots of things that you could still do. And I tried to make the most of the situation in that way.
So how do you think the pandemic will affect the Japanese people and society in the long run?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that the pandemic showed everybody was that there's a lot of flexibility that people didn't really think existed in terms of the Japanese workplace, particularly for white-collar work. So how you work, where you work, what time you work, where you live, commuting, all those things were suddenly changed. And so that produced a lot of flexibility that I think was perhaps unexpected, but it also produced a lot of problems. So, we all read stories about an increase in domestic violence cases, questions of, husbands who perhaps had been away from the home, having to reckon with what it's like to be cooped up with kids all day long and how that can impinge their ability to do work. And so I think long term, there's a lot of potential in that awareness of flexibility around work-life balance and how people's relationships to their companies exist. So if that's one thing that people can learn from the pandemic, for both the negative sides and the positive sides, I think that sort of seems like an element that will change society in certain ways. The other side of it, I think, is that during the state of emergency, really, really quickly, we saw places where people gather, cultural sites, live houses, izakaya, restaurants, things like that, suddenly just empty out. And part of that makes a lot of sense because, we're afraid of catching coronavirus. But at the same time, it really made people realize how much they had depended on those spaces in their everyday life. So going forward, after the pandemic, knock on wood, I think that one of the things that people here will need to think about is what are the ways to make sure that those kinds of businesses are sort of, not lost, that they're valued, that they're able to be sort of maintained, even despite, difficult situations like the pandemic.
What was your research about exactly?
So I came here to do a research project on Kabukicho, a neighborhood in Shinjuku, and I was interested both in the history of Kabukicho over the post-war period, more particularly from the Heisei, beginning of the Heisei period on, because it's a neighborhood that has been undergoing really, really massive changes over the last 20 to 30 years. And at the same time, I think it sort of offers some traction to think about a future in Japan that is more diverse in some ways, a future that has reckoned with dealing with rising numbers of tourism, changes in the economy. And so Kabukicho seems to me a place where a whole host of past and present and sort of future potential all congeal. And so I wanted to do an ethnography, kind of historically oriented, but also on the ground talking with people about those changes in Kabukicho.
Interesting. Please tell me more about it.
Sure. So since summer of 2019, I've been doing a research project on the Shinjuku neighborhood of Kabukicho. It's known for being a diverse entertainment district, red light district, and increasingly and somewhat surprisingly, it's also been a place that has welcomed more and more numbers of tourists. The global coronavirus pandemic hit Kabukicho hard, and it hit Kabukicho early compared to a lot of places in Japan. And it presented challenges, some of which were unique to the neighborhood itself, and others of which I think were felt in other neighborhoods, in other parts of Tokyo, in other cities, and around the country. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about was an exhibit that was held in July 2020 by the Tokyo-based artist collective known as Jimbocho. It was centered around a series of large banners, billboards, adorned with slogans. And these were slogans that were taken from sort of government efforts to educate people about coronavirus. And the phrase was, "Atarashi seikatsu yoshiki," or the new lifestyle. If you want to put it a little bit kind of sarcastically, it would be, the new normal. And so this was a slogan from the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare. And what Jimbocho did was they took that slogan and painted it onto big billboards with sort of a mottled blue and gray background. And alongside the slogan for the Tokyo Olympics, Tokyo 2020, they put those billboards in Kabukicho in a variety of spots back in May. And took pictures of them, and then did an exhibit in July showing those billboards and framed pictures of the installation. Part of what they were doing was to try to get people to reframe their focus on local spaces, sort of the lived reality of coronavirus at a time when those places like Kabukicho, were emptying out of people, right? And they were also sort of ironically pointing to the fact that Tokyo 2020, the idea that everybody would come and fill Kabukicho hotels with people who'd spend money, go out drinking, suddenly all of those things were imperiled, right? Despite the slogan, a new normal, Kabukicho had already been part of Japan's new normal in a lot of ways. And it was also part of Japan's old normal. The mix of ethnicities, the kinds of illicit work, the wild fringes of nightlife, often, though, meant that Kabukicho was seen as a place that wasn't really normal. It wasn't really mainstream Japan. So when I first started to do this research project on Kabukicho, I mentioned to a friend of mine in Tokyo that I wanted to study urban life in Tokyo, and I was going to do it based in Kabukicho. And she said, why would you do that? Kabukicho is not Tokyo. It's not a good place to study Tokyo. It's a place that's full of foreigners and tourists and people from the countryside. And to a certain extent, she's right? It's kind of a chauvinistic thing to say it in the way that she did, but it's kind of true. And yet, in the dense fabric of urban life in Tokyo, Kabukicho has always been, well, for better and for worse, a place that's at the core of social change in post-war society. Take, for instance, the mix of ethnicities. This is a story that goes back to Japan's multi-ethnic empire. Take, for instance, the sleepless nemuranai machi, the sleepless neighborhood sites of night work and sexual services. These are things that have been a part of the metropolis for many decades, right, if not centuries. Take, for instance, the gray market economy. This is driven by intimate bars, by off-the-books commerce, by a dense web of relationships. And that's something that reflects the way that community forms have durability, even, amid and resisting against top-down regulation. And that's something that you can see in post-war black markets and subsequent decades of the 20th century as well. So Kabukicho is a place where outsiders arrive. It's a place where people who have fallen through the cracks rebuild. It's a place where tourists now have been welcomed to Tokyo. And that's kind of bizarre to think about from the perspective of, say, 20 years ago when I first arrived as a study abroad student to Japan. Kabukicho was the one place people said, it's dangerous, don't go there, you have to be careful there. And now you've got a hotel in every block and menus in every different language, right? Also, when images of either the heights or the depths of the urban experience in Japan come up, whether it's in literature or video games or manga or mass media, Kabukicho is often called upon to represent that. And despite the fact that it's actually a really small space, it's only about 90 acres, it plays this outsized role in the imagination of what urban life is, right? Both good and bad. So in many ways, Kabukicho collects the past, it reveals the present, and it augurs what may come for the future in changes that Japan will see in coming years. So if I can pull a couple references to anthropology, if native and newcomer coexist in Kabukicho, and we can see Kabukicho as something of a neighborhood node in this megacity of Tokyo. What does it mean, though, when Japan is grappling with the threat of economic decline, of a rapidly aging society, of a moribund birth rate, and what does this neighborhood portend given those kinds of situations? Kabukicho itself is in Shinjuku Ward, and Shinjuku Ward is the most diverse part of Tokyo and of Japan more generally. And part of that diversity comes not just in the people who live there, but the people who arrive there. So when COVID-19 first started to break out in Wuhan, Kabukicho was really quickly marked by an absence, and that absence was Chinese tourists, later other tourists from Asian countries, and then soon after by tourists from countries outside of Asia. So even before, right, we were talking about the cruise ship, moored off of Yokohama, Kabukicho saw very quickly what it feels like to have the floor fall out of tourism. Everything seemed to shut down by March. Kabukicho had been gearing up for massive crowds for the Olympics. There were new hotels that I mentioned, multiple language menus. For years, the Tokyo metropolitan government had been working on cleanup campaigns to push sort of the seedier, the dirtier, the least attractive parts of Kabukicho's culture out, either to eliminate them or to push them to other areas of the city. And the Rugby World Cup that was hosted here in 2019 was sort of a test run for whether Kabukicho and Tokyo and Japan more generally could deal with an influx of tourists, not necessarily from Korea and Taiwan and mainland China, right, but from sort of non-Asian countries, right? There were some hiccups around language use, around behavior, cultural expectations, but generally the Rugby World Cup was seen as a really successful event, and it was one that made people excited for the Olympics in 2020, if only from the perspective of the potential for business. So the sudden disappearance of tourists after coronavirus was not just an economic shock, but it was also one that hit people really viscerally in visual ways that you didn't expect, right? The city felt hollowed out. Kabukicho felt like what had once been a place teeming with activity suddenly was kind of desolate. This eerie quiet in the early months of coronavirus in Japan was punctuated also in Kabukicho by outbreak clusters, right? Places that were not quiet, places that didn't listen to the demand to stay home. So we had clusters showing up in host clubs, hostess clubs, and that became part of the media scrutiny around Kabukicho in March, in April. These struggles were uniquely prominent in Kabukicho, but they affected nightlife and cultural events and areas all over the country. So in Yoru no Machi, the euphemism for host and hostess clubs, their business model, sekyaku o tomonau inshoku, right? Drinking and enjoying conversation with people, right? Drinks and companionship. This was upended by fears of virus transmission, by pressure from government, by pressure from landlords, by pressure from media, and also, in addition to those kinds of restrictions, by personal pressure that people felt to not become customers of such places. As small business owners began to receive assistance and freelancers gained the ability to apply for special funds to support themselves during the emergency period, Kabukicho businesses and workers had to navigate whether forms of sex work, both explicit forms of sex work as well as sort of implicit sorts of sex work, were eligible for that kind of support. The kind of gray legal area that they occupied made that even more difficult. And so as potential customers' lives as well were upended by economic worries and troubles, things like sex work, things like entertainment, things like going out to the bar were seen as not necessary, right? They were luxuries, they weren't necessities. And so those sorts of businesses became even more further imperiled. Some Kabukicho businesses found ways to move past that. So for instance, the Loft Network has a series of live houses for musical performance, but also places where talk lives, toronkai, discussion sort of performances take place. They're part of a broader group of music venues and live interactive spaces that were able to recalibrate and go online to do sort of digital transmission of the kinds of things that they had offered. They were also able to organize through the communities of bands and intellectuals that had used their spaces to sell commemorative t-shirts, to get donations, to do other kinds of mutual aid based on the existing communities that had grown to love them and use them as spaces. But live houses too, like host clubs and like sexual services, were part of the domestic story of where you could find clusters. For live houses, this was mostly in Osaka, not in Tokyo, but the Tokyo ones were really, really cognizant of not becoming, the source of a new cluster and felt really immense pressure to protect their own reputations as well as sort of the health of their fans. Host clubs and hostess clubs, as well as the small bars and places like the Golden Guy in Kabukicho, are really not able to go online though. And so while a live house can have a musical performance, of a band to an empty room, or have a DJ performance that can be live streamed on YouTube, places that are venue-centric, like small bars, have a really hard time rendering that experience online. Moreover, and in particular for the Golden Guy, as the Golden Guy had retooled itself to cater more to tourists and become more open to people that were not sort of regulars, right? It used to be that the Golden Guy had this feeling of like ichigen-san o kotoari, like you couldn't just show up if you were a fresh customer. As the Golden Guy had retooled itself to be more open to tourists, one of the things that they lost was that network of regulars who often felt pushed out. So those regulars are exactly the people that a small bar might depend upon during times like this. And for some places that meant that they didn't have that resource available to them any longer. Because the equilibrium of these kinds of businesses is really delicate, right? The money that comes in is pretty similar to the money that goes out in terms of staffing and rent. coronavirus quickly showed how precarious this sort of business can be. So to return to the exhibition by Jimbocho that I described at the outset, Kabukicho is a place where the new normal hit hard and it hit early. With the tourists gone and with sex work and nightlife and entertainment suddenly seen as optional at best and dangerous at worst, it's really worth drawing our lens around how local areas are where we can see how state intervention efforts, how community mutual aid efforts take shape, how sometimes those efforts from both above and horizontally develop unevenly, right? And how we can see certain kinds of resilience that offer sort of a hint of the fabric of life that moves through a place like Kabukicho. If Kabukicho is a barometer of change in Japan, then coronavirus highlighted the perils of an economy that's driven by tourism. And yet, the extent of the shock of having tourists disappear also conversely reveals how successful Kabukicho had been in welcoming tourists to begin with. In terms of labor, as young people have continued to be drivers of infection in Japan, Kabukicho highlights questions about what kinds of work are valued, what kinds of work are supported in Japan of 2020. Both in kind of a nebulous social sense, what's a stigmatized or not stigmatized job, but also in concrete forms. What kinds of people are able to get the benefits of unemployment insurance or support for being out of work or for having their livelihood impacted by events like this. And finally, the forms of mutual aid that cropped up among a variety of cultural industries, not just the live houses that I mentioned, but also film theaters, small theatrical venues, public art. These things recenter not simply where people look for community in times of crisis, but also, again, where they had found it before the crisis took place. So I think one of the things that Kabukicho in particular has shown during this time of Corona is that we would all do well to consider what Tokyo without such spaces, without those kinds of cultural spaces would look like. Their presence is a huge part of why tourists arrive to begin with. And those are the spaces where people find meaning, where people find sociality in the megacity of Tokyo, despite the pressures of even normal life, much less that of Corona.
いかがだったでしょうか。シリーズポストコロナ世界における分断と交流、外国人研究者が見たコロナ禍の日本。次回もぜひご覧くださいね。ナビゲーターはサヘルローズでした。